We're here at the VTC near Oakham, and with us this evening is our Rutland Water Reserve Officer for Specialist and Species and Recording, Tim Sexton, and he's got a very, very fascinating talk. He's been doing some work under the surface, so to speak. But just to let you know that at the end of this presentation and the end of the questions, it's the time of year that the Rutland Group hold their AGM. Now, those of you who know about the Rutland Group AGM know that it lasts about 2.5 minutes. But if you'd like to just hang on for that, just so that we can clear that business, but that will be at the end of the presentation. So thanks very much, everybody. I'm now going to hand over to Tim. So I'm going to hand over the microphone, and we'll be turning the lights out here so that the folks sitting here at the VTC will be able to see the screen, and you will of course have your armchair view of the presentation on your PCs. So thanks, Tim. Here we go.
Right, well, thank you ever so much for that introduction, Anthony. This is the first talk we've really done that's been a hybrid between face-to-face and on Zoom, so hopefully this will all work fine. I will be talking to the audience here face-to-face, so obviously if I'm shouting down the microphone, you may just want to turn the volume down on your computers, but I've moved the microphone a little bit away from my mouth now, so hopefully it should be a good volume for everyone here. Put your hands up. All good, thank you very much. And if I'm just okay to start sharing my screen. Which I'll be able to find somewhere. You'd think I'd be used to this by now, wouldn't you? Right, I don't appear to have a share screen button on there, Harriet. Are you okay to point us in the right direction? Oh, there we go, right in the middle.
You got it? Yeah.
Oh, it's always the last place you look, isn't it? There we go. Right, so hopefully you can see this now.
Yeah.
I should be able to find. Okay, can you see the main title screen there?
Yes.
Impressive, great diving beetle. What I'll probably do is just minimize down. There we go, if that's okay. Right, as I say, I may drop in and out a little bit out of the view, so just bear with me. There we go. Right, well, welcome everybody as well to the VTC, and thank you, as I say, for the introduction, Anthony. So, this evening we're going to have a dip, if you excuse the pun, into the underwater world of Rutland Water. I think it's a place where very few people have ventured, and up until last year we knew relatively little about in terms of the biodiversity associated with the underwater world of Rutland Water. So hopefully I'll give you a bit of an introduction over the course of the next hour or so to what goes on under the waves and what keeps all the wonderful wildlife on top of the water as well, hanging around. So just a quick introduction to myself. This is where I'm normally found, on my hands and knees, scrubbing around looking for invertebrates. I've been a keen entomologist for probably about 30 years. I started getting interested in wildlife at the tender age of 7, but was more interested in birds then. During my mid-teens, it turned to ladies or girls, and then I went back into wildlife and started getting interested in invertebrates. It's a course of natural progression, I think, for many ornithologists. They get interested in butterflies and then dragonflies, the big sexy invertebrates, and then it gets smaller and smaller, and eventually you end up like me, looking for things like sub-millimeter little pseudoscorpions and the likes hiding away in the leaf litter. I'm also a keen macro photographer, so all of the photographs that you'll see, certainly of invertebrates tonight, of the aquatic invertebrates, will have been taken in my special little photography tank. So I set this up a few years ago so that I could get some nice pictures of some of the macro invertebrates that are under the water in our freshwaters across the UK. And it's a great way of being able to share how wonderful they are with people. Now, just for those of you that are on Zoom, and perhaps some of you that are in the room tonight, just a briefest of introductions to Rutland Water. So Rutland Water sits in Rutland, the county. It's the smallest county in Britain and has the motto multum in parvo, which is Latin for much in little. And I think Rutland Water and the wonderful wildlife that we find here very much kind of epitomizes that much in little. The reservoir itself was excavated between 1971 and 1975, and it was flooded in 1976. And it's the largest reservoir by surface area in England. And they achieved this by flooding a couple of the villages locally, so Nether Hambleton and Middle Hambleton, and a couple of the ancient woodlands remnants which are still present around the edge of the peninsula of Hambleton and Barnsdale. The reservoir itself is 17 miles around. If you include the peninsula, it's just over 23 miles. I think some of the visitors that came at the weekend when it was nice and sunny will appreciate just how far that really is. Where I'm often based, which is just to the left-hand side in the middle of the screen, is where the Anglian Water Birdwatching Centre is, and a hub for visitors to come and grab themselves a coffee. And some of them that have come from right the other side of the screen on the right-hand side sort of ask you how far it is until they get back round to their car park. And when you tell them that they're only halfway around, they look at you with a rather shocked look on their face. Some of them have got tiny dogs that they're having to carry around at that stage because the poor little legs have got too tired. Some have got children that they've abandoned at other car parks around the reservoir because the children couldn't walk that far, and yet the adults have continued. So it's quite interesting to see just how large it really is. And of course, it's my job as Species and Recording Officer to survey not just the nature reserve, but parts of the main reservoir as well. It can feel a bit like being at the sea sometimes, and this was taken just a few weeks ago when we had that particularly windy weather. The total volume of water is 124 million cubic meters. Just to give you an idea of just how much that is, if you were to run a tap, it would take 175 years to drain. So it's an awful lot of water. It's quite unique in its conception in that it was decided long before the reservoir was built that it would include a nature reserve. Originally, it was just 3 lagoons. So those are Lagoon 1, 2, and 3, just there. And it was designated in 1991 as a SSSI, a Site of Special Scientific Interest, a Ramsar and an SPA for its internationally important populations of overwintering waterfowl that came here. Now, the nature reserve sits at the western end of the reservoir and it covers an area of 393 hectares, and it's managed by Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust in partnership with Anglian Water, who are the reservoir owners. Now, as I mentioned, it was designated back in 1991 for its internationally important populations of overwintering water birds. We have somewhere in the region of about 20,000 plus ducks come to visit us every winter. And that's not including gulls. So we did a gull survey the other week in the peak of January, and we had about 60,000 gulls come in to roost overnight. So just literally the water turned white with birds. It was an incredible sight to see. A couple of features of the designation are shoveler. So we hold internationally important populations of shoveler, so 650 come in, normally during the late autumn months, so sort of September, October, and they're gone by the winter. But this year's been quite interesting, and many of the shoveler have hung around. So we've had about 200-300 shoveler throughout this winter, but also internationally important populations of gadwall as well. So around 1,400 gadwall, which is about 4% of the northeastern European flyway population of that species. So let's have a little look about the wetland habitat. So across the UK, it's considered that freshwater ecosystems are one of the most threatened habitats, with biodiversity loss within freshwater occurring much faster than terrestrial or marine habitats. It's estimated that 90% of freshwater habitats have been lost or destroyed in England alone in the last 400 years. And actually, most of that loss has occurred in the last 100 years. Mostly this is due to things like urbanization, unsustainable farming, industrialization, plenty of different reasons. And in 2020, the EA, the Environment Agency, released figures that showed that not one single lake, river, or stream in the country was in good chemical health, which is an absolutely shocking statistic. And only 14% had good ecological status. So freshwaters generally at the moment are in a state of, well, dire straits really, to be honest. So some of the threats include pollution from herbicides and pesticides, so farmland runoff. You've got road runoff where you've got de-icants, you've got salt, you've got rubber residue, hydrocarbons. Then you've got medicines that enter our freshwaters. So you've got things like hormones and steroids, hay fever remedies. There's an interesting statistic. There's 35 million people in the world that are prescribed Prozac for depression. Now, the chemical in Prozac, about 20 or 30% of that is actually passed straight through the body, and it's not processed by water treatment work, so it ends up going into our rivers, streams, and lakes. And that chemical actually causes things like reduced mobility in freshwater snails, not that they could move very fast anyway, but also it causes reduced fertility as well. Then you've got microplastics, which is quite a new phenomenon that's coming about that's causing massive issues for, again, our freshwater habitats. The list goes on. It's really quite depressing. Now, considered to be one of the greatest threats to biodiversity in our freshwaters is the introduction of non-native species. And in Rutland Water, we've got huge populations of quagga and zebra mussels. Now, quaggas cause massive problems for water companies, as I'm sure Anglian Water are aware. They clog pipework. They actually are filter feeders. So the water, since the quagga mussels have been introduced to the reservoir, has become really clean. But of course, they outcompete native species of crustacean and mussels and mollusks. Quite a lot of survey work's been done by Anglian Water and the Environment Agency within the main reservoir, actually looking at alien and non-native species. Just to put it into perspective how bad it was this year when the water level dropped to about 70%, 75% of its holding capacity, the water level went right down, and literally you couldn't see for quagga mussels and zebra mussels. They literally, you walk along, it's just crunching under your feet, the shells. They're great food for things like tufted duck. We have, in the winter somewhere in the region of about 8,000 tufted duck stop off here. So it provides a great source of food. Another recent colonist in the UK is this species of small shrimp called Hemimysis animala, also known as the bloody red mysid. It's a pontocaspid shrimp, and it was first discovered in the UK in my neck of the woods, just off the River Trent in Nottingham, at the Water Sports Centre there, back in 2004. Now, at the moment, because it's so recent, we don't really know what impact this species is going to have on some of our native populations of invertebrates, although it's possible that they're going to have a direct competition for food at some point. Although recent studies have shown that perch really like to eat them. So you get huge swarms of these, and they almost turn the water red when you see them around pontoons and the likes. But probably the two of the most scariest of the crustacean species, the shrimps, are the Dicerogammarus. So both Dicerogammarus hemobaphes and Dicerogammarus villosus, the demon shrimp and the killer shrimp. I mean, the name says it all, really, to be honest. They're both found at Rutland. They're very aggressive species that consume vast invertebrate prey. And of course, the one that probably lots of people know, the signal crayfish, which across the country has caused massive problems through introducing crayfish plague to our native populations of white-clawed crayfish. This one actually is very close to me. So if you catch a crayfish, a signal crayfish, you're not allowed to release it back into the wild. So it either has to be put in the freezer or humanely dispatched. I caught 2 on this dipping session I did. And I kind of felt sorry for them because they were quite young, little immatures. And I took them home, and they're now residing in my fish tank. Well, I say they're both residing in the fish tank. I call them Reggie and Ronnie after the craze. And Reggie escaped the other day, and I found him in the living room when I was sat watching telly. He sort of crawled past me. How on earth he managed to get out of the fish tank, I do not know. But they were introduced into Britain mainly to, I suppose, feed fish populations. And again, through the pet trade, you know, this is where a lot of these non-native species appear from. So through the years of surveying at Rutland, we've learned lots about the wetland wildlife. We've counted over 5.5 million birds through our web surveys, the wetland bird surveys, in 45 years. We monitor every stage of wading birds' life cycle through our breeding wader survey. We capture footage of aquatic mammals on our trail cameras. But if I was to ask you what goes on beneath the surface, very few people would be able to answer that question. Perhaps this pintail could give you a few clues. There's been a couple of studies. In 2003, the Micropaleontological Society came to look for fossilized ostracods. Now, these are sometimes called seed shrimps. They're a small crustacean. And whilst they were here doing that, they also looked for some modern living examples. Then, of course, this thing came along. And I wondered at that point whether we actually know more about the world, the underwater world of Rutland from 190 million years ago than we actually know today. Now, which is not the main reason why I've decided to start looking at it in greater depth. But obviously it's, you know, quite an interesting fact. Now, in the UK, over 3,800 invertebrate species spend at least part of their life in the underwater. Some, like this four-spot chaser, are really obvious. They spend much of their life underwater as a larvae. In the case of the emperor dragonfly, this can be anything up to 2 years. We don't get the golden ring dragonfly here, but that can be up to 5 years as a larvae in the water. So a huge amount of their lifetime is spent underwater. Surprisingly, there are also a number of moths that have semi-aquatic life cycles as well. So this is the brown China mark. It's one of 4 China mark species that have been recorded here at Rutland. And the larvae develop within a section of pondweed leaf, often something like Potamogeton natans. The small China mark, they make their little dwelling in duckweed. It's a very tiny species. The small little caterpillar lives within a small piece of duckweed. And then some invertebrates like these Daphnia, the water fleas, are not so obvious, but through their sheer collective biomass are just as important as a large juicy dragonfly larvae. I quite like the Daphnia. There's about 80 species in Britain. They've quite an interesting life cycle, both an asexual reproductive phase, and then they have a sexual reproductive phase with the Aphipia, these little sort of backpacks with eggs that they carry around with them over the winter, and then eventually they'll hatch the following year. Now, aquatic invertebrates play a really important part of the freshwater ecosystem. They break down organic matter, they filter the water, and they provide food for fish, birds, and mammals. And as we find out through the talk, they also inform us quite a lot about the health of the aquatic ecosystem as well. Now, I thought before we do that, we'd have a look at some of the fish species and some of the mammals and some of the birds that are on the surface and feeding on a lot of the invertebrates that we get under the water. Now, surprisingly, the only fish that's recorded from the actual nature reserve part of Rutland Water is the 9-spined stickleback. I suppose in part that's because many of the lagoons are quite new, so they've only been around since 2010, and partly because nobody's really gone out looking for them. They're quite difficult to census unless you do something like electrofishing, or most of our data, certainly for the main reservoir, comes from anglers and the species that they catch. Now, there are many more species that are found on the main reservoir, 17 species I've calculated. Possibly one of the best known is the rainbow trout. So I've got to thank Jack Perks for providing me with all of these images. He's done some wonderful work. Locally, I know him from Nottinghamshire, but underwater at Rutland with his scuba gear on, following the fish around. The rainbow trout brings many hundreds of anglers to Rutland Water from far and wide, even from some areas that you might think are fantastic for trout, like Scotland and Ireland. They come to Rutland because there's some fantastic fish here. And I found out the other day, if you had to guess how many fish, how many rainbow trout are introduced each year into Rutland Water, how many would you guess? Like 10,000, 20,000? It's 80,000. And they're all just over £1.50 pound, because obviously if they were much smaller fish, they might get eaten by things like the cormorants, the herons and the likes. So £80,000 fish introduced to the water every year to keep the fishermen going. There are also brown trout. The brown trout do really well here. I think the record is 17.5 pounds for a brown trout, which is, you know, we're talking like sea trout size there, massive. And among the trout, a host of apex predators, such as pike, big sort of 20-25 pound pike come out of the water. Perch, we mentioned earlier, like the bloody red mysid shrimp, and also zander, which is typically native in central and eastern parts of Europe and is now considered an invasive species in the UK. It's sometimes referred to as the pike perch, a very aggressive species and really quite popular with sport fishermen. There's also ruff, roach, rudd, dace, minnow, you know, the list goes on. But also the spine loach, which is quite a scarce species. And in fact, they're restricted in Britain to just 5 rivers that fall within the direct catchment of the Midlands. So the Trent, the Welland, the Witham, the Nene, and the Great Ouse. And I first encountered this species when I was with Jack at Attenborough Nature Reserve, where I worked for the last 15 years prior to coming to Rutland. And we were doing a BioBlitz event, and we were doing some fish monitoring as part of that. And we came across this little guy. Now, in turn, the fish provide food for other species. Obviously, the Rutland ospreys, 3311, the male of the pair at Manton Bay, finally returned today after about a week and a half of Maya, his partner, being here, just waiting for him to come back. And then there's mammals. Now, the reality of mammal recording is that you spend a lot of time looking at poo. And this was an awful lot of poo. It's otter poo. It was found between Shovelhide and Smewhide, and it was obviously a very popular thoroughfare for the otters to use going from Lagoon 3 across to Lagoon 2. And occasionally you get really lucky, and on a trail cam you might be able to capture an image. Now there's actually 2 that came into this shot here. We have quite a healthy population of otters at Rutland Water. I've been here just over a year now, and I managed to see my first one in the daytime. I had the wrong lens on at the time. I've always got my macro lens on, and at this point I could have done with my telephoto, but I caught it just as it moved off the bank. I was cleaning out the San Martin banks on Lagoon 2, and it swam across South Arm 3, calling to its mate, which was fantastic. Now, ospreys, as I said, are very well known at Rutland, but they weren't the only reintroduction project that took place here. Back in 2011, we reintroduced water voles to the local area. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, the population, the local population, or natural population, if you like, declined to just a handful of individuals, and then eventually just disappeared off our radar completely. And between 2011 and 2013, just over 1,000 water voles were introduced to the Rutland Water Nature Reserve. They come in tubes of Pringles. I understand other flavors are available, but that one's a tomato, mozzarella and basil flavored water vole. I don't know what difference that makes. But before we did that project, we had to make sure that the local landscape was clear of the North American mink, another aquatic mammal that's decimated populations of water voles within Britain and caused a lot of problems for water birds as well. So we've not had any mink seen on the site now for about 9 years, which is really good. And all thanks to the works of a couple of volunteers that we've got in the room today, actually. Linda and Anthony Biddle, they've been monitoring the mink rafts, or the otter rafts, as we call them now, because we get more otters than mink seen on them, since pretty much day one. They go around the reserve every few weeks looking at the water vole trays to see if there's any signs of activity. I've just realized I've taken a picture of one that has absolutely no signs of water vole activity on them. But normally, as Anthony and Linda will tell you, they'll be covered in perhaps a salad plate of fresh vegetation that's been cut up by the water voles, or perhaps something more like this, these little brown, sort of purpley brown tic-tac shaped and sized droppings, which are a good indication that water voles are present. This is an example of a big salad tray that they leave behind as they've been feeding. Now, they're largely vegetarian. They'll eat berries and aquatic vegetation, but they'll also surprisingly eat a wide range of aquatic invertebrates as well, mollusks, tadpoles, and even small fish, apparently, as an additional source of protein. And one of the best places to see them on the reserve is actually from wader scrape hide, I think, on the Linden side of the reserve, where you can see the ospreys as well. And often you'll see them going between the fingers of reed bed there. And it's not the only aquatic mammal we get here, sort of small mammal. We also get water shrews, and we're just about to embark on a new volunteer-led project, looking and trying to understand about the spread of water shrews on the reserve. So in the next couple of weeks, they'll be going out laying poo tubes. I know it sounds like a popular social media channel, but basically they put out these bits of pipe, drainage pipe, put some casters, fishermen's casters in there. And what they'll do is, obviously, when the shrews go in and eat the casters, they leave a little present behind in the shape of a water shrew poo. And then our lovely volunteers will analyze those using a microscope back in the visitor center. And we'll see how far they've spread. Now, above the water, you also get aquatic mammals, such as the Dorbenton's bat, which feed on insects on the water's surface. They've got fantastic adaptations. They fly low over the water and use their stiff tail membrane to scoop up insects off the surface. We also have a really healthy population of Nethusius pipistrelle here as well, which are, again, also sort of largely associated with the more aquatic habitats. In addition to the 8 lagoons on the reserve, we've also got 50 small ponds. This is one of the 4 ponds in Cherrywood, and they've been studied over many years for amphibians. The 4 different species found on the reserve: the common frog, the common toad, smooth newt, and then, of course, the great crested newt. And at least 20 of those ponds have been found to contain great crested newts over the last sort of 30 years where we've been doing the monitoring. So it's safe to say that Rutland Water's certainly got a rich diversity of aquatic wildlife supported by what goes on beneath the surface. But how do we monitor the aquatic ecosystem? So the 8 lagoons here receive water from a number of different sources. So you've got lagoons 3, 4, and 2, which receive their water from treated water from the Oakham Water Treatment Works. You've got lagoon 7, which receives water from, well, not just surface water, but also agricultural runoff. So there's potential for high phosphate and nitrate levels in that lagoon. And then you've got lagoon 5, 6, and 8, which are all fed from the main reservoir. Now, obviously, the different sources of water have got potential to cause some problems and impact on the health of the aquatic ecosystem. And in spring last year, we noticed that there were large mats of filamentous algae quite early in the year forming over a number of the lagoons. We also noted things like frothy orange scum appearing, which we're not quite sure what species of algae this is, but it's obviously responding to high phosphate levels in, I think this was lagoon 6. And then in lagoon 3, probably the most alarming of all, was when literally the whole water body was covered in what looked like grass clippings. And this turned out to be a blue-green algae, a cyanobacteria called a Phanazomenum flossaque, which has potential to form toxic blooms and can then impact on Daphnia populations. It affects their fertility. We've also got some non-native invasive plants like New Zealand pygmyweed, Crassula helmsii. And what we want to do is we want to see what those impacts are going to potentially have on the freshwater invertebrates, which obviously then feed up through the food chain and could potentially affect what the reserve is special for, and that's, of course, the overwintering duck populations. So currently there's no standardized methodology for sampling large water bodies like lakes. Smaller bodies like ponds and rivers are quite well covered. So we use a method called the Bmwp, or Biological Monitoring Working Party. And it's a sampling method that involves us sending in our trainees or other willing volunteers into the water in a pair of waders. They sweep around with a pond net for 3 minutes. They spend another minute having a look around the area they were covering for any surface dwelling invertebrates. And then we empty the contents into a sample tray. And that's then when the fun work begins. So in Bmwp sampling, 82 different groups of macroinvertebrates are given scores that represent their tolerance to oxygen depletion and therefore pollution in the water. Animals that are intolerant of pollution score much higher, and animals that are less tolerant, or more tolerant, sorry, are given a low score. So you identify the species down to family level. So it's relatively straightforward, although I don't know whether some of the volunteers that I've been out with over the last summer will agree, but they got it in the end, and it became, you know, quite a fun task. So you key them out down to family level. Some of the high scoring families are things like the mayflies. This one here is an adult rather than a larvae that would record. It's Ephemera danica, and they score 10. Stoneflies, which unfortunately we don't find here, they're more found on sort of pristine rivers, also score 10s. And then you've got things like caddisflies and some dragonfly and damselflies that are also high scorers. There's some groups that are not covered, so those are mosquito larvae, which this one is here. You also get phantom midges, although you do record Hydrometridae, which are very similar looking to both the phantom midges and the mosquito larvae. Now in 2019, it's just the other aquatic invertebrate survey that was carried out here in the history was when we partnered up with Public Health England to look at mosquito populations on the reserve. We had a funny device out behind the visitors centre here, and 9 species of mosquito were recorded during that project. Now, phantom midge larvae, although we don't include them on Bmwp, I thought I'd include here because they're pretty interesting creatures. They're only a few millimeters across. They're often called glassworms, and they're pretty cool. The adults look like mosquitoes. They fly around a bit like Hydrometridae, the non-biting midges. They don't have a long proboscis and they don't bite. The larvae, however, they're pretty aggressive, especially if you're something like a daphnia or a small shrimp. So they've got some really interesting adaptations. One of those is these hydrostatic organs. You can see those disc-like things either side. And they work a bit like swim bladders. So they basically balance the creature out in the water so they can just sit motionless. And then they've got these fused antennae, which you can see in front of the eye there, which are modified into a grabbing hook, which they can use to grab insects out of the water and pull them into these really interesting mouth parts, which, you know, quite detailed if you look at them under a microscope. Now, caddisflies, the Trichoptera, are very well studied here. There's 83 species in total have been recorded in the last sort of 30 or 40 years of recording. This one's, I believe, Limnophilus binacartus. Now, Limnophilus is Greek for pool loving. So you find these in sort of small pools, smaller water bodies. In the larvae, most species have a mobile home that they carry around with them that you can see there. They use various items, anything from sand grains to leaf fragments, and even the body parts of dead invertebrates like snails, for instance. There's been some interesting scientific sort of experiments where they've put bits of gold and jewels and stuff in the water, and they've made these lovely jewel encrusted cases. You should look it up on Google at some point. Now, when I say they're well studied, the adults are very well studied. So there's a volunteer called Ray Morris who's been recording them for many, many years through mostly moth trap bycatches and other studies like vein traps that we've been running and malaise traps. So the moth trappers that are operating on the reserve, they'll take out the bycatch, send it off to Ray, and he'll work through all the caddisflies and all the other smaller diptera that people really generally struggle with other than Ray. He's a great bloke. One of my favorites of the case caddis has to be this one, Limnophilus flavicornis. They make this absolutely crazy case of like butted and overlapping plant segments, and it almost looks too big for them to carry around. You wonder how on earth they get along. But obviously they provide some protection from other invertebrates that might be looking to eat them. Now, as I said earlier, most dragonfly and damselfly nymphs score quite highly, particularly the emerald damselflies and the demoiselles, they score 8. This is the common emerald. I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here. This is the adult common emerald. And then a species that we spent a lot of time studying this late summer and early autumn is the willow emerald, which is a species that was first encountered in Norfolk in 2007. There was only 2 prior records in Britain before that. And then in 2009, there was a bit of a boom, and around 400 were counted in that area of Norfolk. And then they started to spread north. And about 2 years ago, we had some anecdotal records of Willow Emerald at Rutland, and we wanted to prove that. So this year, or last autumn, we went out and we surveyed probably about 15, 20 of the small ponds that we'd expected to find this species, and we found them at pretty much all of the ponds that we went to. Now, the main difference between the Willow Emerald and the common emerald, if you look on the wings, they've got those little pale spots, the pterostigma, and on the common emerald, if I just go back to it, they've got black pterostigma. It's one of the main ways to tell them apart. Now, one of the reasons I included them in this talk is because they have a fascinating life cycle. So the females in the autumn will lay their eggs in a willow branch overhang. In fact, they'll use other trees as well. They've been noted using hawthorn, ash, oak, alder, anything that's suitable, overhanging water. They'll lay the eggs in the bark. The eggs will develop over winter, and in the spring, the larvae will drop out into the water below, and they complete that first stage of their life cycle, which is, you know, when they're most at risk from being predated on as an egg, relative out of harm's reach on the branch of a tree. Now, aquatic Hemiptera are probably one of the most diverse group and have some quite interesting adaptations themselves. Unlike other insect groups, they don't have biting mouth parts, they don't have mandibles, they have like a proboscis, a sort of short feeding tube that they'll stab their prey with. They inject like a poison and a digestive juice, which will start digesting their prey from the inside, and then they'll suck it back out through this straw like a thick, juicy milkshake. Sounds a bit disgusting, really. Like most of the true bugs, the water boatmen here, the Chorixidae, they score 5 in the Bmwp survey, so right in the middle. There's 37 species in Britain, and we wanted to have a look at these in greater detail. So we took samples of all of the Chorixidae that we were catching, and although we were doing everything else down to family level, we wanted to identify the Chorixidae down to species level. There's been some studies in the 90s by a chap called Savage looking at whether certain species of Chorixidae actually have differing tolerances of pollution. So we want to see if that perhaps rang true for here as well. This one's Saigara Dorsalis. And the way to identify them is to look at the male parla. So the parla are the modified front legs, and they use them in mating to grip onto the females. And if you see here, they've got 2 distinct rows of pegs that are unique per species. So you'll have a look at the parla of the males. You may need to look at the genitals for some species, but it's relatively straightforward to identify them down to species level just from that. Now, the smallest member of the family of Chorixidae is Micronecta schultzii, which is just about 2 millimeters in length. It's considered to be the loudest creature known to man relative to body size. And what if I told you it's classified in the Guinness World Records as having the loudest penis in the world as well? So what it does is it makes a call, mating call to the females by rubbing its penis on a ridge of its abdomen. And it's an area just about the width of a human hair, but it can make the equivalent sound of 99.2 decibels. Now, to put that into perspective, that's equivalent to a freight train passing by in sort of human size. And they're said that people can actually hear them when they're stridulating, making this mating call from the water. They're that loud. But absolutely incredible, just 2 millimeters across. Also, another small species is the pygmy back swimmer, Plea minutissima. It's the only member of the Pleiadae family that we get in the UK. And again, only about 2 millimeters across, up to about 2.7 millimeters. And they feed predominantly on Daphnia. So you can see how the food chain's moving up. These things feed on the Daphnia. Other larger creatures feed on these. And speaking of larger creatures, this is the water scorpion, Nepacinerea. They're not a scorpion at all. Obviously, they're a true bug. And the tail is not a sting, as some people believe. They can't sting you. They can give you a bit of a nip, I think, if you tried. They grow up to about 3.5 centimeters long, and the tail's actually an adapted breathing tube. So they're able to pass oxygen through to the spiracles on their abdomen, to enable them to breathe. And for that reason, they often stay in quite shallow waters. They're not very mobile. They tend to just walk around. They do have fully developed wings under the wing cases, but they can't fly. They have underdeveloped flight muscles. And they're not very good swimmers either. They're pretty rubbish aquatic invertebrates, to be perfectly fair. But they make up for it with their aggressive nature. So you can see this one digging its proboscis there into a small shrimp, which one of the Bmwp. It'll just hang about in the water, wait with its long, almost like praying mantis-like front appendages that it will grab onto any unsuspecting creature swimming past. Now, a similar species is the water stick insect, Renatra linearis. It's the largest water insect in the UK in terms of its body length. They feed on things like tadpoles, small fish even, and crustaceans, similar to the water scorpion in the way they hunt, a bit like a praying mantis. And again, they've got this long breathing tube out the back that acts a bit like a snorkel. And like I say, they inject this venom into their prey that not only paralyzes it, but then starts to digest it before they suck it back up through their proboscis. You've also got Hydrometridae, which sit around on the surface. This is Hydrometrostagnorum. There's 2 species in the UK. There's one that's slightly rarer, Glacilentra, which is found around Norfolk and areas of Sussex. I think there's only about 8 sites probably in the UK where that's really commonly found, and it's nationally scarce. And these things will just skate around on the surface of the water. They don't break the surface film. They've got these hydrophobic hairs, just thousands of them on their feet, which enable them to just, keep their body weight above the water. And also the similar hairs on the body as well, which repel water droplets that would otherwise weigh the insect down and perhaps cause it to drown. They feed mostly on springtails and smaller invertebrates that are skating around on the water's surface. And another skater is the well-known pond skater, the Geridae. I think there's around 9 species in the UK. And again, they have these same hydrophobic hairs across their body and on their legs. They're just, these little micro hairs. It's about 1,000 per millimeter of leg, and that repels the water. Now, beetles is a particular area of interest for me, both terrestrial and aquatic beetles. I spent most of my early days looking at weevils, which are my favorite group. But in terms of the aquatic beetles, there's 14 families in total, comprising around 283 species, although nobody really can argue how many species there are, because some are not truly aquatic, although classed as aquatic. So it all depends. Some people say up to 400 species, but I think 283 is probably the closest you'll get to true aquatic beetles. Only 34 have been recorded at Rutland, and there's probably, the aquatic beetles are possibly the most recorded group of aquatic organisms found here. This one's Heliphorus brevipalpus, which is a water scavenger beetle, and they like the stagnant temporary pools. They're very active flyers and can move readily overnight between different bodies of water. So if one's about to dry out, they'll fly somewhere else. And they're often encountered in moth traps in the sort of late spring, early summer, where they go to the light, a bit like a moth would do. Some of the most impressive are the Ditiscidae, the diving beetles. This one's Rantus suturalis, which can grow up to about 1.5 centimeters. So quite a chunky little thing. Columbetes fuscus is another one of the diving beetles. It's carnivorous at all stages of their life cycle, as is the previous species. This grows up to about 2 centimeters. But the one everybody wants to find is one of our largest beetle species in the UK, both for terrestrial and aquatic, which is Ditiscus marginalis, or the great diving beetle. The adults of this species can grow up to about 3.5 centimeters long. They're, voracious predators, both as adults and larvae. The males are quite interesting in that they have suction pads on their front legs, which enable them to grip onto their females. This one's a female, and you can see they've got very ridged elytra, the wing cases. And it was previously thought that the ridged elytra actually help the males grip onto the females. But because these suction cups, the males have these suction cups, what actually happens is the ridged elytra actually make it more difficult for the males to hold on. So only the very fit males will actually get a chance to mate with the females. So sometimes they have to grip on with those suction cups to the smoother pronotum of the female. Now, last year, so middle of the summer, late summer, my colleague Luke, who does the ringing here, he'd been out ringing one morning in one of the wetland areas, and he came back with this giant Ditiscus that he'd found. And he says, Tim, I found this in the back of the truck. It was dead, I would add. So I put it on my desk and sort of forgot about it for a day or so. And one afternoon, I was sitting eating my lunch, sandwich in one hand, and I thought, I'll just take a look at this beetle in a bit closer detail. So I put it under the microscope, and I realized it was a species called Ditiscus Circumflexus, which is just a handful of records in VC55, so Leicestershire and Rutland. So really good to, just give that a second glance. I originally just sort of dismissed it as Ditiscus marginalis, this common species, but it just goes to show, perhaps just have a second look. It's not always going to be the common species that you find. And what you do to identify them, the best way is to look at this metacoxal process, which is the area that's circled there. In Ditiscus marginalis, it's bluntly pointed. In Circumflexus, it's very elongated and very sharply pointed. And also, Circumflexus has black marks on the sternites, those under plates there. Now, like I say, adults and larvae are voracious predators. I would say probably the larvae more so. They can grow up to about 6 centimeters in length, the larvae of the Ditiscus marginalis, the great diving beetles. They've got these massive curved mandibles that are hollow, and they enable them to catch their prey. And then similarly to the true bugs, the Hemiptera, they inject a poison which starts to digest the body of their prey, and they suck it back out through those sort of almost drinking straw mandibles. Pretty gruesome, aren't they? You can understand why I like aquatic invertebrates. Flatworms we encountered quite a lot. They don't score very highly in the Bmwp. Most of them only score around 3 or 4. This one's Polycellus tenuus. The genera Polycellus, there's one called Felina, I think, which actually has little ears, looks a bit like a kitten or a cat, or like it's got cat's ears. Most of the species will feed on waste products within the water. Some will also be very successful active hunters. Anybody that did sort of higher level science at an early age will probably remember dissecting one of these perhaps, but you can cut them into sort of 3 parts, and each part will regenerate into a new flatworm, which is pretty cool. When they say what happens if you cut an earthworm in half, does it make 2 earthworms? Well, no, it makes just 1 dead earthworm. But with flatworms, about 25% of their body contains adult stem cells that can regenerate into a whole new creature. They're pretty cool, aren't they? This particular species, you can see how many eye spots it's got going around the top part of its body there. And then similarly to the flatworms, you've got leeches. Here's our 9-spined stickleback again. Poor things covered in this Glossophonia complantata, which is not necessarily solely a fish leech, but they do obviously predate on leeches quite a lot and suck their blood. When I worked at Attenborough, I did a similar study looking at aquatic invertebrates there, and surprisingly, leeches were Attenborough's most well-studied aquatic invertebrate. So I think there's only 2 records for leeches down to species level at Rutland. So perhaps if anybody fancies taking the reins and looking at leeches, that's a good area to start looking at. So let's have a look at the analysis of Bmwp. So the table up the top shows you how we sort of categorize it and analyze it. If you've got a Bmwp score of 0 to 10, it's considered to be heavily polluted and very poor. 11 to 40 poor, 41 to 70 moderate, 71 to 100 is good, and then anything above 100 is very good. And then the table at the bottom, now we didn't do many sample points, so what we're going to have to do over the coming years is do additional sample points to back up this evidence. But what you can see is Lagoon 3, which is the lagoon that's fed directly by the treated water from the sewage works, has the lowest Bmwp score. And Lagoon 8, which is one of the lagoons that's only fed by the clean water of the main reservoir, has the highest score. So which is pretty much how we thought it would turn out. Lagoon 7, which is the one that gets the agricultural runoff, again, has a relatively low score. You'd consider that to be moderately impacted. So it's just really interesting to see how those figures have come out just from the small studies that we did last year. And it gives us grounds to look into this in more detail. Now, some of the future plans are we'd set a load of pitfall traps to look at some of the terrestrial but sort of aquatic, semi-aquatic invertebrates. And through the Microscope Club, we're going to be working through some of the specimens that were caught there. Some like this green socks peacock beetle, they call this one, Elaphorus riparia. And if you see it glistening in the sun, it's amazing, just the green against those purple spots that almost look like a peacock's tail. But also sort of aquatic spiders like Pyrata pyraticus, the pirate wolf spider is another favorite of mine. Like many of the wolf spiders, they're very loving parents. They'll carry around the egg sac, and then when the eggs actually hatch to the spiderlings, the female will carry around like sort of 50 or 60 spiderlings on her body until they get too big for her to carry them anymore. I thought it's hard with 2 kids and having to carry one of those on each shoulder around the park, but they really do go above and beyond. And again, they just skate across the water surface and predate on things like, you know, some of the small springtails. We also found some quite interesting things whilst we were doing the invertebrate sampling, not of interest for the Bmwp survey, but just of general interest. So the green Hydra, Hydroviridicima, we found in the ponds in Cherrywood when we were doing a sample there. These are actually relatives of jellyfish and the corals. It's quite amazing to find them in landlocked Rutland. They have this particular species has a symbiotic relationship with algae, and they photosynthesize to provide energy for the creature. They've got stinging tentacles, and again, they'll feed on things like small crustaceans and other invertebrates in the water. Now, I've not actually come across it here, but this is a freshwater sponge called Spongilla lacustris. They contain, very much similar to the Hydra, they contain tiny single-cell plants which photosynthesize. And with this species, the more light they receive, the greener they get. Now, there's been some divers that have gone onto the main body of the reservoir that have recorded this species, although it's one that I've looked for at many places and been unsuccessful. But what I have managed to find is this insect, which is a relative of the lacewings. It's called Saigara fuscata. And as a larvae, they actually feed on freshwater sponges. Now, we found them here at Rutland, so we can only assume that there's a healthy population of freshwater sponges here. There's a number of different species, because obviously we've recorded the adult stage. So it'll be really interesting perhaps to look into in greater detail. I was wondering whether Jack Perks might take me on a scuba dive or a snorkel trip around the main water in the summer, perhaps. So as I always do, I'll end on a sunset overlooking the lovely church at Normanton over the main body of the water. And I thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to open up to some questions, although you just have to wait for me to sort the online folk out so that I can stop sharing and come back to you guys. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We don't have any questions at the moment online. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A.
Is there any questions from, oh crikey, the light's just gone. Any questions from in the room? How many get through the water treatment works in terms of the aquatic invertebrates? So most of those, well, in fact, all of them will be filtered out at that stage. So most of like the solid. So the next part of this project really is to start looking at the water chemistry. So we're hoping to get some local universities involved or some academics to actually look at the chemical makeup. No, because I mean, a lot of that will be surface water runoff and obviously drainage from, the local housing. They have just enlarged a facility there. And from what I understand, although there's regulations for the outputs that water treatment companies in the UK are allowed to release into fresh waters in the country. And because of the size of this one, they're not under the same stringent restrictions as some of the larger water facilities are, but because the water flows into the Ramsar SPA, the designated nature reserve, they follow those same guidelines, if you like. So there are some, they do monitor orthophosphate levels, biological oxygen demand, and suspended solids in Lagoon 3, directly in line with the outflow. I don't think I'd want to look, to be honest. Yeah, no, we haven't. No, because I mean, it's coming from there into here, and then obviously goes into the main reservoir, and then is filtered then for drinking water. So, yeah. Have we had any other questions come through? Okay, so there's one here. So is there any regular census requirements, or is it just a best effort basis? So in terms of the census requirements for the Bmwp, on a smaller water body, you would only need to do probably about 4 samples to satisfy that you've covered sort of a representative area of the habitat. With the larger lagoons, I would probably suggest we need to look at sensibly doing maybe 20 samples per lagoon. Now, I probably see some of the volunteers that are in the room with me that go out and do the sampling go, oh! But we've decided to simplify the methodology a little bit. So whereas before we were doing species richness and species abundance, so we were counting every single invertebrate. So at times we would have like 100, 200 like water boatmen, for instance, and it took probably the best part of 4 or 5 hours to go through each sample. So what we'll do the next time round is we'll get the same data for the Bmwp score by just recording the number of different families that are there. So it will speed up the process of recording and mean that we can do more samples and make it more effective.
Okay, there is a question in the Q&A. Where do the brown trout come from? I thought they only bred in very clean rivers.
Yeah, so the brown trout are also introduced to the waters. So Anglian Water will release a smaller number. I don't know what the figures are for brown trout, but certainly the rainbow trout's the biggest number that they introduce. So, I mean, like I said, you know, the quagga mussels and the zebra mussels in the main reservoir, it is a drinking water reservoir. So you'd like to hope at least that the water quality is going to be, you know, very clean there and pristine. Yeah, we've done that question. Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we've got through all of the questions, and thank you for all the lovely comments as well. And like I say, thank you for listening to me and taking a dive into the underwater world of Rutland. I'll hand you over now. Oh, sorry. How is the water oxygenated? Just one last question has just come in there. So there's a massive bubbler. I'm sure there's a scientific term for it in the main reservoir, which it's a massive sampling station, the limnological tower as well. So there's 2 main bubblers, the limnological tower, which does all the chemical analysis in the main reservoir. But I guess the oxygenation for the main lagoons comes from the submerged vegetation for the most part.
Okay.
I'll hand you over to Anthony now. No, that's a pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. That was obviously very, very superb talk. So interesting. We just don't often have the chance to hear what goes on under the water. We hear a lot about the birds and the plants and everything around, but that was superb. Thank you very much indeed, Tim. An excellent talk. Thanks very much.